that after lunch we may have the kind of experience that one preacher had one time. He was up preaching and the song leader fell asleep. And so he got kind of loud just before the invitation, and he rapped on the pulpit one time, and boy, that song leader jumped up and was startled, and he looked at the preacher and said, "Preacher, I don't know what you just said, but you and I are the only two for it." And so hopefully there'll be more than two for what we're going to talk about today here in a few moments. But I'm so thrilled to have the opportunity to study Colossians chapter 3 with you this afternoon and to look at the material that is here. We're going to go through the chapter looking at 4 different things that appear in the chapter that are so consistent with the entire book. And then I want us to spend just a little time at the end looking at some possible preaching points from Colossians chapter 3. Just a little helpful thing. Brother Wendell Winkler used to call those snowflakes, but I'm not going to really give you a snowflake. It's not even a whole flake. We're just going to give you some titles and let you come up with your own points. And then I want us to think very personally as gospel preachers for a few moments at the end of this as to how to apply this chapter to my own life. Something that preachers are bad about doing, and if I point a finger at you, I've got 3 pointing back at me, is that we often preach for others. We sometimes forget to preach for ourselves. And personal study and spending time in the Word on our own for ourselves almost becomes an impossibility because our days are so filled and there's just so much going on. And I believe that Colossians 3 contains a great deal for our lives. And so I want us to spend some time thinking about Colossians 3 for the preacher. But I believe there are 4 distinct points that are so consistent with everything. Andy did such a fantastic job this morning with chapter 1 in looking at the completeness in Christ. And that's one of the things that just jumps out off the page at you. Jesus is, as will later be said even in this chapter, in verse 11, the all in all. And so we are made complete in Him. But one of the ways in which we are made complete is by becoming new. And so there is a newness that just flows throughout this entire chapter. First of all, he is talking about new in thought. We are to set our minds on things above and not on things of this earth. A new mind, a new way of thinking. Secondly, new in action. In verses 5 through 11, therefore put to death your members. We are to put to death the sinful things of life that we have pursued and begin to put on things that are new. And so new actions are to be committed. Then we're to develop a new character. Now it may seem like we're getting the cart before the horse. Well, they have good character before we have good action. But the actions had to cease immediately. We understand that. The character actually does develop a little bit later on as we recognize we begin to live by those actions that we have lived in. And then Paul gets very particular, and he does this on other occasions as well, as he begins to enumerate certain people and says, here's how we're to live our lives. And so new in life, a new life that he wants us to live in Christ Jesus. As we begin to look at some introductory thoughts, chapter 3 is the practical answer to Paul's prayer in chapter 1. Paul is wanting them to grow in knowledge and to be a knowledgeable people. I realize that many of us, and I think I had done this, and I'm not going to call it a mistake because I believe God foresees things, and well, I know that God foresees things, and as a result can anticipate problems. Did he not do that in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15 by pointing out that the seed of woman was going to bruise the head of the serpent, the seed of the serpent? And so God foresees things, and as a result is able to anticipate them. Gnosticism was not in full bloom at the writing at the time of the Colossian letter yet. The Colossian letter takes on Gnosticism by dealing with knowledge. And so Paul in chapter 1 is praying about their knowledge and to have the kind of knowledge that comes from God. That's the real knowledge. The Gnostics would say, oh, no, it's okay to have the knowledge of God, but you need to have knowledge of the world. You need to have knowledge of the mystical and the mythical, and have all of those in your life, in your repertoire. And so God anticipates that here. But as he is talking about these new things, he is giving us a practical answer. So Paul puts legs on the needs that the church had so that they could be the new man in Christ that God wanted them to be in this life. The Colossians were apparently doing quite well, it would appear. Very positive letter. Some have always talked about Philippians being so positive. Colossians is a very positive letter, but they were dealing with some horrendous probabilities, like Gnosticism that would come down the pike later. They are dealing with the various forms of Judaistic teaching that was coming from the Judaizing teachers, and so chapter 2 dealing with that. But they were doing fairly well, but now Paul wants to give them a very structured way to grow. And we really see that here in chapter 3. The descriptions of the Christian life are exhilarating and inspirational as he talks about hidden with Christ in God. He talks about the new man. He talks about being the elect in God and then being holy and beloved. Now, holy and beloved flows throughout this book. And that's where he wants them to be. I want you to be set apart, and I want you to understand how loved you are by God. The theme of this chapter, the new man, runs thoroughly throughout it. It seems clear that the new life in Christ is this theme. The term only appears one time in verse 10, but the concept of new thinking, the concept of new actions, of new character, and of new life flow throughout this entire text and is dominant. Many scholars have compared the letter of Colossians with Paul's letter to the Ephesians, and chapter 3 is sort of a capsulized version of several parts of the letter to the Ephesians. We see much of chapter 2, much of chapter 4, parts of chapter 5 in this. And so it's really exhilarating to come to chapter 3 and to see how Paul tied together so many subjects that were dealt with in the much more extensive book of Ephesians. He talks about the encouragement to teach one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, very similar to Ephesians 5:19 and found here in 3:16. There is also the concept of the new man in both letters, found in Ephesians 2:15, 4:24, and then here in chapter 3 and verse 10. So let's begin to look at these four areas this afternoon. And then, as we said, if we have some time at the end, we want to spend a little bit of time talking about preaching out of the chapter of 3 in Colossians, and then dealing with the preacher's life. As we think of new in thought, verses 1 and 2 tells us that if then we have been raised with Christ, seek those things which are above. We are no longer to seek the things on the earth and be living for those things. We need to get our heads out of the dirt and begin to stick them in the clouds. And we need to think as Christ would think. And so this comes across so clearly here. As the mind goes, so goes the life. When we set our minds on something, it will direct our steps toward that goal. The Philippians, for instance, could overcome the problem of Euodia and Syntyche by changing their thought process. And so in verse 8 of chapter 4 in the book of Philippians, he says, finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue and if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. Paul wanted the Colossians to also dwell on thoughts that were above. Don't keep thinking down here. Begin to think a much higher form of thought. The person who has died to the world and been made alive in Christ must stay focused on the goal of getting to that heavenly home. When I was growing up, we worked a farm for a fellow. This fellow lived in Houston and couldn't live around China Spring where I grew up. And his farm was just across the road from our house. And so he just gave that farm to us and said, y'all use it any way you want to. Just take care of my cows. If one of them getting old, sell it off. Do whatever you want to over on that place. So it became our place. And we worked that farm. We grew 10 acres of corn every year. And I helped my dad do a great deal of that. I would do some of the plowing. Daddy did the drilling.